I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're folding laundry, cleaning your kitchen floor, or coming home after a long shift, your shoulders heavy with tiredness. The morning light filters through worn curtains, casting shadows across calloused hands that have scrubbed more floors than dreams. Another day begins with the same quiet prayer for strength. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierces through the thin walls of Rosa Martinez's apartment at 4:30 in the morning. She doesn't need it anymore. Her body has memorized this rhythm after 15 years of service. The floorboards creak beneath her bare feet as she moves through the darkness of her studio apartment on the third floor of a weathered brick building in Pilsen, Chicago's heart of resilience. The radiator coughs and sputters, offering little warmth against the October chill that seeps through single-pane windows. Rosa's hands, mapped with lines of labor and sacrifice, reach for the faded floral dress hanging on a hook behind her bedroom door. The fabric has softened with countless washings, but it's clean and pressed. Dignity worn like armor. She braids her graying hair with practiced efficiency, each strand pulled tight and secure, ready for another day of invisible work in a world that barely acknowledges her existence. The kitchen, barely larger than a closet, holds the essentials: a small refrigerator humming with effort, a 2-burner stove that requires coaxing, and a wooden table scarred by years of use. Rosa prepares her lunch: 2 bologna sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, an apple bruised but sweet, and a thermos of coffee strong enough to fuel hope. The brown paper bag crinkles as she folds it carefully, this modest meal her only indulgence in a day that will stretch nearly 12 hours. Through her window, the city awakens with familiar sounds: garbage trucks rumbling down narrow streets, the distant hum of the Red Line train carrying early commuters, children's laughter echoing from the playground below. This neighborhood breathes with life, warm and real and human. Mothers call to sons in Spanish, elderly men gather around dominoes on stoops, and the aroma of fresh tortillas drifts from corner markets. Here, Rosa is known. She is Doña Rosa, the woman who sends money to her mother in Guadalajara every month, who helped Mrs. Hernandez when her husband had his heart attack, who never misses Sunday Mass at St. Adalbert. But at 5:45, Rosa locks her door and begins the journey to another world entirely. Her worn boots click against concrete as she walks 6 blocks to the Ashland Pink Line station, past murals that tell stories of struggle and dreams, past shops with hand-painted signs, and windows filled with quinceañera dresses that shimmer like promises. The early morning air carries the scent of panaderia bread and coffee from 24-hour diners, mixing with the exhaust of city buses and the river's distant dampness. The train platform fills with Chicago's working souls: hospital orderlies heading to morning shifts, security guards ending night duties, cleaning women like herself carrying similar brown bags and silent determination. Rosa finds her usual spot near the back, her reflection ghost-like in the train window as neighborhoods blur past. The city transforms before her eyes. Weathered buildings give way to gleaming towers, community gardens yield to manicured parks, and the faces around her grow paler, more expensive, more distant. 43 minutes later, Rosa emerges at the Clark Division Station in the Gold Coast, where Chicago's wealthy have built their fortress of privilege. The streets here whisper with luxury. Imported cars purr past limestone mansions, boutiques display single dresses that cost more than Rosa earns in 6 months, and even the air seems thinner, cleaner, purchased by money that flows like an endless river. She walks 8 more blocks, her modest frame dwarfed by buildings that pierce the sky like glass and steel declarations of power. The Whitaker Tower rises 37 floors above Lake Michigan, its penthouse occupying the top 3 levels like a crown of arrogance. Rosa enters through the service elevator, her footsteps muffled by marble floors that gleam with cold perfection. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow fragments across walls lined with paintings worth more than most homes, while floor-to-ceiling windows frame the lake like a private ocean, its waves indifferent to the loneliness that money cannot cure. Alan Whitaker built his fortune methodically, turning his father's modest investment firm into an empire worth $800 million. His portfolio stretched across real estate developments, technology stocks, cryptocurrency investments that multiplied like digital gold, and offshore accounts that sheltered wealth from taxes and conscience alike. Financial magazines featured him on covers, calling him the Wizard of Wall Street's Wind, praising his ability to predict market fluctuations and capitalize on others' desperation. Yet for all his assets, all his capital gains and dividend yields, Allen possessed something that no amount of money could purchase, an emptiness so profound it echoed through every room of his magnificent prison. The penthouse reflected its owner's soul, beautiful but barren, expensive but cold. Italian leather furniture sat arranged in perfect symmetry, never touched by human comfort. A dining room table carved from single piece of mahogany could seat 12, but served only solitude. The kitchen, outfitted with professional-grade appliances and stocked with delicacies from around the world, produced meals that Allen ate alone, while scrolling through profit reports that meant nothing when the profit was measured only in dollars. Never in joy. 3 years ago, cancer had stolen his wife Margaret, taking with her the last traces of warmth from their home. She had been his anchor, the one person who saw through his wealth to the frightened boy from Cicero who had clawed his way to success. After the funeral, after the condolences and casseroles stopped coming, Allen retreated into his work with the devotion of a monk seeking salvation in numbers. His portfolio grew, but his heart withered. His children, Michael, 26, a lawyer in San Francisco, and Sarah, 24, pursuing her master's degree in Boston, called dutifully every few weeks, their conversations stilted with unspoken resentments and geographical distances that measured more than miles. When Rosa first arrived at the penthouse 6 months ago, recommended by an agency that specialized in discretion and quality, Allen barely looked at her. The previous housekeeper, a sharp-tongued woman named Mrs. Patterson, had quit after discovering that working for a grieving millionaire meant navigating mood swings as unpredictable as the stock market. Rosa entered the service interview wearing her best church dress, her hands folded, her eyes respectfully lowered, but missing nothing. "The position requires absolute punctuality," Allen had said, not looking up from his laptop screen, where cryptocurrency prices fluctuated in real time. "I don't tolerate theft, gossip, or personal phone calls during work hours. You'll be responsible for cleaning, laundry, and basic meal preparation. I entertain rarely, so most days you'll work alone. The salary is competitive, but I demand perfection." Rosa had nodded silently, understanding that his coldness was armor, not cruelty. She had worked for wealthy families before. The Harrison family in Lincoln Park who spoke to her only to criticize, the Goldbergs in Evanston who deducted pay for broken dishes, the Richardson widow who counted towels and accused Rosa of taking soap. She recognized the particular loneliness that wealth cultivated, the way money insulated people from human connection while surrounding them with beautiful objects that could never love them back. Her first day began at 6 in the morning. Rosa unlocked the service entrance with a key that felt heavy with responsibility and fear. The penthouse exhaled silence as she moved through rooms that showcased Allen's success but hid his sorrow. She began in the kitchen, cleaning surfaces that were already pristine, organizing spices that had never been used, polishing appliances that reflected her own face back to her, a woman whose worth was measured by her invisibility. Allen appeared at 7:30, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Rosa's monthly rent. He moved through his domain like a ghost haunting his own life, pausing to check stock prices on his phone while his coffee grew cold. He didn't acknowledge Rosa's presence, but she felt his attention sometimes, a weight of observation as she worked. She dusted around him while he conducted conference calls about hedge fund investments and cryptocurrency portfolios, her movements synchronized to the rhythm of his financial empire. The other staff members, a part-time cook named Jeremy who prepared elaborate meals that often went uneaten, and a maintenance supervisor named Frank, who came twice weekly to tend to the building's mechanical heartbeat, treated Rosa with the casual dismissiveness reserved for those deemed replaceable. Jeremy, a culinary school graduate whose ambitions had been reduced to serving a man who barely tasted food, made cutting remarks about Rosa's simple appearance and quiet demeanor. Frank ignored her entirely, as if acknowledging her existence might somehow diminish his own importance in the household hierarchy. But Rosa continued her work with the patience of stone worn smooth by water. She learned the penthouse's secrets, which floorboards creaked underfoot, which windows caught the morning light best, how the afternoon sun painted golden rectangles across the living room floor that no one stopped to admire. She discovered Alan's habits, too, how he stood at the eastern windows each morning with his first cup of coffee, staring at Lake Michigan as if searching for answers in its waves. How he worked late into the night, his office light visible from the kitchen as she prepared his dinner. How he sometimes paused in hallways as if listening for a voice that would never call his name again. The penthouse held whispers of the life that had been. Margaret's reading glasses still on the bedroom nightstand, her favorite teacup unwashed in the kitchen sink, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the breakfast table with her handwriting fading like memory itself. Alan had preserved these artifacts of love like a museum curator, afraid to disturb them but unable to live fully in their presence. Rosa understood this particular grief, the way loss could freeze a heart in time while the world continued spinning around it. Days passed in careful routine. Rosa arrived before dawn, worked through the morning hours while Alan conducted his business from his home office, and stayed late to prepare his solitary dinners. She moved through the penthouse like a prayer whispered in empty space, her presence so quiet it became essential. Floors stayed polished, meals appeared on schedule, and laundry materialized, folded and fresh in drawers that smelled of lavender sachets. Rosa bought with her own money because she believed even rich men deserved small comforts. But beneath the surface of their professional arrangement, tensions simmered. Rosa ate her simple lunch alone in the kitchen, while surrounded by a pantry stocked with imported delicacies worth hundreds of dollars. She watched Alan discard plates of barely touched food, while her own stomach cramped with hunger that she disguised as dedication to her work. The waste troubled her deeply, not from envy, but from a moral understanding of abundance squandered while others struggled. In her neighborhood, Abuela Morales rationed rice to make ends meet, and teenage mothers worked double shifts to afford baby formula. Here, exotic fruits rotted in crystal bowls, while a man worth nearly $1 billion pushed food around his plate like a petulant child. Cold autumn rain began falling on a Thursday morning in October, tapping against the penthouse windows like fingers seeking entry. Rosa arrived to find Alan standing in his kitchen, surveying the contents of his refrigerator with the expression of a man confronting an impossible equation. Leftover roast beef from Jeremy's elaborate dinner sat untouched, expensive cheeses developed blue spots in their imported wrappings, and vegetables that cost more per pound than Rosa earned in a day wilted in their organic glory. She watched him close the refrigerator door with a sigh of frustration and reach for his phone to order takeout, probably from one of the high-end restaurants that delivered to wealthy clients who had forgotten how to cook for themselves. The waste hit Rosa like a physical blow, and before she could stop herself, words emerged from her mouth like birds released from a cage. "Senor Whitaker," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the rain. He turned, surprised to hear her speak beyond the expected good morning and have a good day that marked their daily boundaries. Rosa felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, but hunger and principle drove her forward. "The food you throw away. Could I perhaps take some home to my family? Or could I eat what you're not going to finish?" The question hung in the air between them, like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Alan Whitaker, master of markets and manipulator of millions, experienced something he hadn't felt in years: genuine surprise at human honesty. For a moment, his face softened, and Rosa glimpsed the man beneath the millionaire's armor, but then his expression hardened, walls rebuilding themselves as quickly as they had cracked. A laugh escaped his throat, not cruel, but cold, the sound money makes when it has forgotten its original purpose. "What kind of question is that?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what kind of question it was. The kind asked by people who understood the value of food, who had learned that waste was a form of violence against those who needed. Rosa's eyes didn't drop despite the burning shame that colored her cheeks. Instead, they held a dignity that made Alan uncomfortable, a quiet strength that his wealth couldn't understand or purchase. She saw his discomfort and recognized it for what it was. Not malice, but fear. Fear of acknowledging the world beyond his penthouse walls. Fear of confronting the reality that his abundance existed alongside others' emptiness. "I'm sorry, Senor," Rosa said simply. "I didn't mean to overstep." She returned to her work, moving through the kitchen with renewed focus, while Alan stood frozen by her question's implications. The rain continued falling, washing the city clean while leaving the penthouse's emotional atmosphere unchanged, thick with unspoken truths and uncomfortable recognitions. But something had shifted in that moment, something as subtle as a crack in a foundation that would eventually bring down walls built of pride and insulation from human need. Rosa had spoken, and in speaking, she had revealed herself as more than just the invisible woman who maintained his kingdom. She had shown herself to be someone with a family who mattered, someone whose hunger was real, someone whose question carried the weight of dignity, refusing to be diminished by circumstance. Alan returned to his office, but the numbers on his computer screen seemed meaningless now. His cryptocurrency portfolio showed gains of $30,000 since yesterday, but Rosa's simple question echoed louder than any profit report. He found himself thinking about her journey to work each morning, the train ride from neighborhoods he'd never visited, the world she returned to each night after cleaning his castle in the sky. For the first time in years, his wealth felt less like achievement and more like isolation, surrounded by abundance while missing the essential nutrients that fed the human soul. The rain stopped by afternoon, leaving the penthouse windows streaked with evidence of the storm. Rosa cleaned them carefully, removing every trace of nature's tears while wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. She needed this job desperately. The salary allowed her to send money to her mother, pay rent on her small apartment, and maintain the precarious balance that kept her life from collapsing. But she also needed to preserve the dignity that no amount of desperation could afford to lose, the pride that was sometimes the only currency that truly belonged to her. That evening, as Rosa prepared Alan's dinner, she noticed him watching her work with an attention that felt different from before. His observation carried weight now, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. When she set his meal on the dining room table, pan-seared salmon with herbs she had bought herself because his pantry contained only expensive items with no soul, he nodded his thanks instead of simply dismissing her presence. Small changes began appearing in the days that followed. Rosa arrived one morning to find that Alan had left specific instructions about food disposal. Leftovers should be properly stored rather than discarded, and any items approaching expiration should be brought to his attention. It wasn't permission to take food home, but it was acknowledgement that waste was waste, regardless of how much money could afford to replace it. Rosa worked with renewed purpose, her movements carrying hope that perhaps understanding was possible between people from different worlds. She began humming while she cleaned, old songs her grandmother had taught her in Guadalajara, melodies that spoke of resilience and faith in better days ahead. The sound filled the penthouse's empty spaces like incense, sweetening the air with humanity's most basic gift, the ability to make beauty from sorrow, music from silence. Alan heard these songs from his office and found himself pausing in his work to listen. The stock market could wait while Rosa's voice carried stories of survival and grace through rooms that had forgotten how to sing. Her humming became the soundtrack to his days, a reminder that life continued beyond the digital numbers that consumed his attention. For the first time since Margaret's death, the penthouse felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home where someone lived instead of simply existed. But the most significant change was growing in Alan himself, though he didn't recognize it yet. Rosa's question about food had planted a seed of self-awareness that was beginning to sprout. He started noticing things he had trained himself to ignore. how much he ordered versus how much he ate, how many resources he consumed without thought, how his wealth insulated him from the basic human experiences of want and gratitude. The armor of privilege that had protected him from discomfort was also preventing him from feeling anything real, anything that might connect him to the world beyond his tower of financial success. One evening, as October surrendered to November and Chicago's wind carried winter's first warnings, Rosa was preparing to leave when she heard an unfamiliar sound echoing through the penthouse. Alan was coughing, deep and persistent, the kind of sound that suggested illness rather than irritation. She paused in the foyer, her coat half-buttoned, listening to the vulnerability in those coughs and remembering how her father had sounded during his final illness. Professional boundaries warred with human instinct. Rosa was paid to clean and organize, not to provide medical care or emotional comfort. But she was also a woman who had nursed sick family members, who understood that wealth could not cure loneliness or buy the kind of care that came from genuine concern for another's well-being. The coughing continued, and Rosa made a decision that would change the trajectory of both their lives. She hung her coat back on the hook and returned to the kitchen, her movements swift and sure as she prepared a remedy her grandmother had taught her. Hot honey and lemon with a touch of brandy, the same mixture that had soothed her brother's childhood fevers and eased her mother's winter colds. The preparation required no expensive ingredients, just simple elements combined with the intention to heal rather than to impress. Rosa carried the steaming mug to Alan's office, where she found him hunched over his computer, despite the obvious symptoms of flu or exhaustion. Market reports glowed on multiple screens around him like artificial suns that provided no warmth. He looked up in surprise when she appeared in his doorway, carrying healing in a simple ceramic mug. "For your cough, senor," she said softly, setting the drink within his reach. "My grandmother's recipe. It will help you sleep better tonight." She didn't wait for gratitude or permission to care. She simply offered what she had and returned to her evening cleanup, leaving Alan alone with liquid kindness and the realization that someone had noticed his discomfort without expecting payment or acknowledgement. The remedy worked better than any expensive medicine from his private pharmacy. Alan slept deeply for the first time in months, his cough subsiding into peaceful rest. When he woke the next morning, he found another small change in his routine. Rosa had left fresh oranges on his kitchen counter, along with a note written in careful English. "Vitamin C for your health, senor. Take care of yourself." This simple gesture cracked something open in Alan's carefully controlled world. Someone was taking care of him not because they were paid to do so, but because they recognized his humanity beneath his wealth. Rosa's care came with no price tag, no expectation of increased salary or special treatment. It was given freely, the way light falls on rich and poor alike, without discrimination or agenda. Over the following weeks, as Chicago's autumn descended into early winter, the relationship between Rosa and Alan began evolving beyond employer and employee. She continued her work with the same meticulous attention to detail, but now their interactions carried warmth that had been absent before. When Alan worked late, Rosa quietly left dinner warming in the oven instead of simply preparing cold plates. When he seemed particularly stressed after difficult phone calls about market volatility, she brewed him coffee the way her grandmother had taught her, strong enough to wake the dead, sweet enough to make life bearable. Alan, meanwhile, found himself paying attention to Rosa's patterns and preferences. He noticed that she never used the expensive hand lotion in the guest bathrooms, instead applying a humble cream that left her hands smelling of vanilla and almonds. He observed that she brought the same brown bag lunch every day, eating bologna sandwiches while surrounded by a kitchen stocked with imported delicacies. He began leaving fruit where she would find it, telling himself it was simply practical management of perishable inventory, though the truth went deeper than such justifications. The penthouse itself began reflecting these changes. Windows stayed open longer, allowing Chicago's urban symphony to flow through rooms that had been hermetically sealed against life. Rosa's humming became more frequent and confident, her melodies weaving through the day like golden thread binding hours together. Plants appeared, small succulents that Rosa tended with gentle efficiency, bringing life into spaces that had known only artificial beauty. One gray December afternoon, while freezing rain turned the city into a crystal palace of ice, Rosa was cleaning Alan's study when she accidentally knocked over a framed photograph on his desk. As she reached to write it, the image caught her attention. A younger Alan standing beside a beautiful woman with kind eyes and an infectious smile, both of them laughing at some shared joke that the camera had captured in their faces. "That's Margaret," Alan said from behind her, his voice soft with memory and loss. Rosa hadn't heard him enter the room, but she didn't startle. Instead, she studied the photograph with the attention it deserved, recognizing love when she saw it preserved in silver and glass. "She was very beautiful," Rosa said simply, "and happy. You can see it in her eyes, how much she loved you." The words were not flattery but observation, the kind of truth that comes from a lifetime of watching people and understanding the languages that hearts speak when their owners think no one is listening. Alan moved to stand beside Rosa, both of them looking at the photograph that had become a shrine to what he had lost. "She died 3 years ago," he said. "Cancer. We had 28 years together, and it wasn't enough. It never would have been enough." His voice carried the particular grief of widowers who had discovered that love doesn't die with the beloved. It continues burning in survivors' hearts like an eternal flame that provides no warmth. Rosa's own eyes grew soft with recognition. "My husband died 12 years ago," she said quietly. "Heart attack. He was only 47. We had 2 beautiful years together after we married, and a lifetime of dreams that cancer took away from us, too." Her voice held no self-pity, only the acceptance that comes from learning to carry loss like a precious burden that teaches the heart about its own capacity for endurance. They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 people who had learned that grief was love with nowhere to go. The photograph smiled up at them, capturing a moment when happiness had seemed permanent and the future had stretched ahead like an endless summer. Outside, Chicago's winter wind howled around the tower, but inside the air felt warm with shared understanding. "She would have liked you," Alan said finally. "Margaret believed that wealth was a responsibility, not a privilege. She used to say that money was just energy, and it was up to us to determine whether that energy created beauty or destruction in the world." He paused, remembering arguments they'd had about his dedication to accumulating assets versus her desire to use their fortune for charitable purpose. "After she died, I forgot that lesson. Money became a place to hide instead of a tool to build with." Rosa nodded, understanding without judgment. "Grief makes us forget many things," she said, "but love teaches us to remember them again when we're ready." She carefully replaced the photograph in its position of honor on his desk, her movements reverent as handling holy objects. "Your wife sounds like a woman who knew the difference between having money and being rich. There are many people with millions who are poor in their hearts, and many people with empty pockets who are wealthy in ways that matter." These words struck Alan with the force of prophecy. He had spent 3 years accumulating wealth as a form of self-medication, believing that increasing his net worth could somehow fill the void that Margaret's death had carved in his soul. His investment portfolio had swollen to unprecedented levels, but his capacity for joy had withered proportionally. He had confused financial growth with emotional healing, mistaking bigger numbers for deeper purpose. That evening, as Rosa prepared to leave for her long journey home, Alan made an unprecedented gesture. He appeared in the kitchen carrying a bag of groceries. Fresh vegetables, imported cheeses, a bottle of wine from his private collection worth more than Rosa's weekly salary. "For your family," he said simply, not meeting her eyes because generosity felt strange after years of hoarding both money and emotional energy. Rosa looked at the bag, understanding its significance. This was not charity but acknowledgement, recognition that she had a life beyond these walls, people who mattered to her, needs that her work here only partially addressed. "Thank you, Señor," she said softly. "My mother will enjoy the fresh vegetables. She hasn't been able to afford such quality since her arthritis made it difficult for her to work. The exchange marked a turning point in their relationship. Alan began leaving small gifts occasionally, never ostentatiously, never with fanfare but consistently. Fresh bread from the expensive bakery down the street, a warm scarf when Chicago's winter grew particularly brutal, a book of poetry in Spanish that he had ordered online without knowing whether Rosa enjoyed reading. These gestures came from a place deeper than guilt or obligation. They emerged from growing recognition that Rosa's well-being mattered to him, not as an employee, but as a human being whose happiness had become somehow connected to his own. Rosa, meanwhile, expanded her care beyond professional requirements. She noticed when Alan's shirts needed mending and repaired them with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. When he mentioned missing his grandmother's apple pie, Rosa researched recipes and presented him with a dessert that tasted like memory itself, sweet with nostalgia and warm with the love that cooking can convey when it's done with intentional care. The penthouse transformed gradually, becoming less museum and more home. Curtains stayed open longer, allowing natural light to paint the rooms with Chicago's changing moods. Music played softly throughout the day. Sometimes Rosa's humming, sometimes classical stations that Alan had rediscovered after years of listening only to financial news. The dining room, once a formal space reserved for business meetings that rarely happened, became a place where Alan ate his meals with attention rather than distraction, appreciating flavors that Rosa coaxed from ingredients with skill that no culinary school could teach. But the most significant change was in Alan himself. His phone calls grew shorter, his obsession with real-time market fluctuations less consuming. He began taking walks along the lake, watching Chicago's skyline change with the light instead of watching numbers change on screens. Investment reports still arrived daily, but they no longer held his complete attention. Something else was growing in the spaces that money had failed to fill, a sense of purpose that went beyond accumulating assets, a recognition that life's most valuable returns couldn't be measured in dollars or deposited in banks. Winter deepened, and with it, the bond between Rosa and Alan strengthened like ice forming on Lake Michigan, slowly, naturally, with surprising power. They developed routines that neither acknowledged but both treasured. Morning coffee prepared to preferences learned through careful observation, evening conversations that began about household matters and meandered into territory they had never expected to explore together. Rosa shared stories of her childhood in Mexico, the village where her grandmother raised chickens and grew vegetables that tasted like sunshine. Alan talked about building his business, the early years when success was uncertain and every decision carried the weight of family financial security. These conversations revealed the people they had been before circumstances shaped them into employer and employee, millionaire and maid, privileged and struggling. Rosa spoke of dreams deferred. She had wanted to become a teacher before economic necessity forced her into domestic work. Alan admitted that he had once written poetry, before the pursuit of financial success consumed all his creative energy. They discovered shared loves, classical music, old movies, the way Chicago looked from high places when snow made the city clean and magical. One evening in January, during a blizzard that transformed the city into a winter wonderland, visible from the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows, Rosa arrived to find Alan standing in his kitchen, staring at his refrigerator with an expression she had learned to recognize as internal conflict. The expensive food inside would spoil if not consumed soon, but eating alone had become a burden rather than pleasure. "Would you—" he began, then stopped, unsure how to cross the boundary between employer and equal. "Would you like to have dinner here tonight? It seems wrong to send you out in this weather, and there's far too much food for one person." The invitation hung between them like a bridge. Neither was certain they should cross. Rosa understood the significance of his offer. Sharing a meal would acknowledge their relationship as something beyond professional arrangement, admitting that they had become friends despite the vast differences in their circumstances. "I would like that very much, Señor," she said simply, and the relief in his smile told her that he had been hoping she would accept. They prepared dinner together, Alan's expensive ingredients transformed by Rosa's skilled hands into a meal that tasted like celebration rather than obligation. They talked while they cooked, their conversation flowing like wine, easy and warming. When they sat down to eat, the dining room felt different, intimate instead of formal, welcoming rather than intimidating. "My name is Alan," he said as they shared dessert, a simple flan that Rosa had made from memory and love. "I realize you've been working for me for 8 months, and I still call you by your last name while you call me Señor. It seems unnecessarily formal, considering—" "Considering what?" Rosa asked, though her eyes suggested she understood what he meant. "Considering that you know me better than most people do," Alan admitted. "You know how I like my coffee, what music makes me relax when I'm worried about business deals. You know that I miss my wife, that I work too much, that I sometimes stand at the windows looking at the lake because it reminds me that there's a world beyond these walls." He paused, recognizing the truth in his own words. "You see me, Rosa. Really see me. And I want you to know that I see you too. Not just as someone who works for me, but as someone whose presence makes this place feel less like a fortress and more like a home." Rosa's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide. Recognition was a gift more valuable than any salary increase. Acknowledgement that her humanity mattered as much as her productivity. "Thank you, Alan," she said softly, his name feeling strange but right on her tongue. "That means more to me than you could know." The storm continued outside, but inside the penthouse, warmth spread through rooms that had been cold for too long. They lingered over dinner, neither wanting the evening to end. When Rosa finally insisted she should go home, Alan offered to have his driver take her, rather than letting her brave the snow-covered public transportation system. She accepted gratefully, understanding that his concern came from friendship rather than obligation. That night marked a new chapter in their relationship, one that would be tested in ways neither could foresee. Rosa had become more than an employee. She had become a source of light in Alan's world, a reminder that wealth meant nothing without human connection, and Alan had become more than a boss to Rosa. He had become living proof that hearts could change, that even the richest people could learn to value what truly mattered. But their growing friendship existed in a delicate ecosystem that could be disrupted by outside forces neither of them controlled. The other staff members had noticed the changes. How Alan treated Rosa with increasing respect, how their interactions carried warmth that transcended professional boundaries, how the penthouse itself seemed more alive when they were both present. Some were pleased by the positive changes, but others felt threatened by Rosa's growing influence, jealous of the attention and recognition she received. Jeremy, the part-time cook whose culinary school credentials had earned him little respect in Alan's household, particularly resented Rosa's expanding role. He watched her prepare simple meals that Alan praised enthusiastically, while his own elaborate creations went largely unnoticed. The inequality stung his professional pride and fed resentments that would soon grow into something more dangerous than professional jealousy. Frank, the maintenance supervisor, observed the dynamics with calculating eyes. He had worked for wealthy clients long enough to recognize the patterns. Employers who became too attached to domestic staff often created problems for everyone involved. In his experience, such relationships rarely ended well for the employees, who inevitably found themselves caught between affection and professional boundaries that society insisted must be maintained. But Rosa and Alan remained unaware of these undercurrents, focused on the genuine friendship that had bloomed between them like flowers growing in unexpected soil. Their connection was pure in its intentions, neither romantic nor manipulative, but simply two human beings who had found understanding across the chasm that usually separated their worlds. They talked about books Alan recommended and Rosa borrowed from the public library, about recipes Rosa taught him that required no expensive ingredients but much patience and love, about dreams they had abandoned and others they might still pursue. Alan began making changes in his business practices, influenced by conversations with Rosa about responsibility and community impact. He redirected some investments away from companies that exploited workers overseas, choosing instead to support businesses that provided fair wages and safe working conditions. His portfolio's profits marginally decreased, but his sense of purpose grew exponentially. He established a scholarship fund for immigrants pursuing education, remembering Rosa's abandoned dream of becoming a teacher and wondering how many other dreams had been sacrificed to economic necessity. Rosa, meanwhile, found herself standing taller, speaking more confidently, carrying herself with the dignity of someone whose worth had been recognized and affirmed. The validation didn't make her proud in destructive ways. Instead, it reminded her that she had always possessed value, even when others failed to see it. She continued her work with the same meticulous attention to detail, but now it felt like contribution rather than mere labor, partnership rather than servitude. Spring arrived early that year, Chicago's harsh winter surrendering to March warmth that coaxed green shoots from frozen ground. The penthouse filled with natural light that had been absent during the dark months, and Rosa opened windows to let fresh air circulate through rooms that had been sealed against winter's bite. She brought small potted plants from her neighborhood's garden center, adding life to spaces that had known only artificial beauty. Under her care, these plants thrived, their growth becoming visible proof that even the most unlikely environments could nurture life when someone cared enough to provide proper attention. Alan watched this transformation with growing appreciation, not just for Rosa's skills but for her wisdom about what environments needed to become truly alive. He had been living in a beautiful tomb, surrounding himself with expensive objects while starving his soul of the nutrients that only human connection could provide. Rosa had brought more than cleanliness to his home. She had brought the understanding that wealth without warmth was just another form of poverty. But even as their friendship flourished, darker forces were gathering like storm clouds on a seemingly perfect day. Jeremy's resentment had metastasized into active hostility, and he began watching Rosa with the attention of a predator seeking weakness. Frank had noticed valuable, small items occasionally displaced, nothing missing but subtle evidence that someone was testing boundaries. The household's delicate balance was becoming increasingly unstable, though Rosa and Alan remained focused on the positive changes in their relationship rather than the negative energy building around them. The crisis began on a warm Tuesday in April, when spring's optimism filled the penthouse with light and possibility. Rosa arrived to find Jeremy in the kitchen earlier than usual, his face set in lines of barely controlled anger. Several expensive utensils were missing from their designated places, and Jeremy's accusations flew like accusation-seeking targets. "I know it's you," he hissed at Rosa as she began her morning routine, taking things bit by bit, thinking no one would notice, but I notice everything in my kitchen. His voice carried venom that had been building for months, professional jealousy twisted into personal hatred. Rosa's stomach turned cold with fear and confusion. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "What things? I haven't taken anything." But even as she spoke, she recognized the futility of defending herself against accusations that weren't based in truth but in resentment that required a scapegoat for its satisfaction. Jeremy's smile held no warmth, only triumph at finally finding a weapon to use against the woman who had somehow earned their employer's respect without possessing his credentials or his sense of entitlement. "We'll see what Mr. Whitaker thinks about his trusted housekeeper being a thief," he said, the words carrying implications that would destroy everything Rosa had worked to build. The confrontation escalated quickly, Jeremy's accusations growing more elaborate and confident as he constructed a narrative that painted Rosa as a manipulative woman who had used her position to steal from a man too lonely to see through her deceptions. Frank appeared, drawn by raised voices, and his testimony added weight to Jeremy's claims. He had indeed noticed items displaced, he said, though he had assumed it was simply carelessness rather than deliberate theft. When Alan returned home that evening, he found his household in chaos, accusations and denials flying between staff members like shrapnel from an explosion. Jeremy presented his case with the confidence of someone who believed his own lies, while Rosa stood silent, her dignity intact, but her position crumbling beneath the weight of false testimony and circumstantial evidence that looked damning to anyone who wanted to believe it. Alan listened to the accusations with growing coldness, his old instincts for self-protection reasserting themselves as he faced the possibility that he had been manipulated by someone he had grown to trust. The friendship that had developed between him and Rosa suddenly seemed suspicious in the harsh light of Jeremy's accusations. Had she been playing a long game, earning his confidence in order to exploit it? Had his loneliness made him vulnerable to deception that a shrewder person would have recognized immediately? "Is this true?" Alan asked Rosa, his voice carrying disappointment that cut deeper than anger. She looked at him with eyes that held no guilt but much sadness, recognizing that their friendship had been fragile enough to shatter under pressure that it shouldn't have had to bear. "No, senor," she said simply. "I have never taken anything from your home except the salary you pay me and the kindness you have shown me." Her words carried the ring of truth, but truth was a luxury that Alan could no longer afford to trust. His world had been built on suspicion and careful calculation. The warmth he had allowed himself to feel toward Rosa now seemed like a dangerous deviation from the caution that had protected him throughout his business career. "I'm afraid I have to let you go," Alan said, the words emerging from his mouth like stones that would build a wall between them that could never be dismantled. "I can't have someone working in my home if there's any question about their honesty." He didn't meet her eyes as he spoke, afraid of what he might see there. Not guilt, which he could have handled, but innocence betrayed by someone she had trusted to protect her. Rosa nodded silently, understanding that defending herself would only confirm suspicions that had already hardened into certainty in Alan's mind. She gathered her few personal belongings, a cardigan she kept for cold days, a small container of the vanilla hand cream she preferred, the book of poetry Alan had given her that she had been reading during her lunch breaks. Her movements carried the dignity of someone who had faced injustice before and survived it, though each instance left scars that never completely healed. As she prepared to leave the penthouse for the final time, Rosa paused at the window where she had often stood to watch Lake Michigan's moods change with Chicago's weather. The water stretched toward horizons that promised nothing but held infinite possibility, its surface reflecting light that could blind or guide, depending on how one chose to see it. "I hope you find peace, senor," she said to Alan, who stood frozen by his own cruelty, watching a woman he had grown to love disappear from his life because fear had proved stronger than faith. "And I hope your home becomes warm again, with people who understand that wealth is not the same as richness." She left through the service elevator, the same way she had arrived 8 months ago, but everything had changed in ways that couldn't be measured by time or money. The penthouse seemed to exhale as she departed, releasing the life she had breathed into its marble halls and returning to the beautiful emptiness that Alan had mistaken for peace before learning the difference between solitude and loneliness. Jeremy watched her leave with satisfaction, believing he had eliminated a threat to his own position and importance in the household. Frank returned to his maintenance duties, the drama resolved in ways that restored the natural order he preferred. Wealthy employers properly suspicious of their staff, clear boundaries between classes, no uncomfortable mixing of affection with professional relationships. But Alan stood at his windows looking out at Lake Michigan, knowing that something essential had just walked out of his life, something that no amount of money could replace because it had never been for sale in the first place. The water's surface reflected his own face back at him, a rich man who had just chosen wealth over wisdom, fear over faith, suspicion over the friendship that had begun to heal his wounded heart. The penthouse felt different immediately. Silence returned, but now it seemed oppressive rather than peaceful. Meals appeared on schedule, but they tasted like cardboard because no one prepared them with love. The windows stayed closed, the plants began wilting, and music disappeared from spaces that had briefly known joy. Alan returned to his computer screens and profit reports, but the numbers provided no comfort. Only evidence that he was accumulating more of something that had failed to buy him happiness or wisdom, or the courage to trust someone who had never given him reason for suspicion. Days passed slowly, weighted with regret that grew heavier rather than lighter as time revealed the truth of what he had lost. Rosa had left no forwarding address, had made no dramatic speeches, had requested no severance pay beyond what her contract required. She had simply disappeared from his life as quietly as she had entered it, leaving behind only memories of warmth and the lingering scent of vanilla hand cream that reminded him daily of his mistake. 2 weeks after Rosa's departure, the missing utensils were discovered in Jeremy's own locker, tarnished and hidden beneath his personal belongings like evidence of a crime that had been carefully staged. Frank found them during a routine locker inspection, and their presence created a mystery that unraveled quickly once investigated. Jeremy's elaborate lies collapsed under scrutiny, revealing a man whose jealousy had driven him to frame an innocent woman whose only crime had been earning recognition that he believed belonged to him. Alan stared at the recovered utensils with emotions too complex for simple names. Relief that Rosa had been innocent mixed with shame at his own failure to trust her, while anger at Jeremy's deception combined with self-loathing for being manipulated into destroying something precious. He had built his fortune by reading people accurately, by recognizing deception, and protecting himself from those who would exploit his success. Yet when it mattered most, he had failed to distinguish between truth and lies, allowing fear to blind him to the authenticity he should have recognized in Rosa's character. Jeremy was fired immediately, his dismissal carrying none of the reluctant regret that had marked Rosa's departure. Frank received a severe reprimand for his role in the false accusations, his future employment contingent on his understanding that loyalty to his employer included protecting innocent staff members from malicious colleagues. But these administrative actions felt hollow to Alan, like trying to repair a masterpiece after setting fire to it, technically possible but never truly restorative. The search for Rosa began immediately, driven by guilt and longing that grew stronger as Alan realized how much her presence had meant to his daily existence. His private investigator located her quickly enough. She had returned to her small apartment in Pilsen, resuming the life she had maintained before their paths crossed. But knowing where she lived was different from knowing how to approach her, how to apologize for betraying trust that had been given freely and received carelessly. Alan drove through Rosa's neighborhood for the first time, his expensive car conspicuous among the working-class vehicles parked along streets lined with small businesses and community gathering places. The contrast between this world and his own struck him forcefully. Here, life happened on sidewalks and stoops, in corner markets and community centers, with energy and authenticity that his wealth had insulated him from experiencing. Children played games that required imagination rather than expensive equipment. Elderly people gathered to share stories and wisdom rather than investment strategies, and the aroma of home cooking drifted from windows open to welcome neighbors rather than exclude them. He found Rosa at a small cart in Pilsen, selling tamales that she prepared in her own kitchen, the same hands that had cleaned his penthouse now creating food that fed her community with pride and skill. She looked the same but different, still dignified, still graceful, but carrying herself with the independence of someone who had remembered that her worth was intrinsic rather than dependent on others' recognition. Their reunion was awkward initially, weighted with history and hurt that couldn't be dismissed simply because truth had eventually emerged. Rosa was polite but distant, her warmth replaced by careful professionalism that reminded Alan of their first meeting. She didn't express anger. Anger would have been easier to bear than the quiet sadness that acknowledged their friendship had been real but fragile, beautiful, but not built to withstand the pressures that different worlds inevitably created. "I came to apologize," Alan said simply, standing beside her cart while Chicago's urban symphony played around them, car horns and children's laughter, street musicians and vendors calling their wares. "And to ask if you would consider coming back. The house isn't the same without you. I'm not the same without you." Rosa's hands continued preparing tamales while she considered his words, her movements automatic from years of practice. "Some things, once broken, stay broken," she said finally. "Trust is like a fine dish. beautiful when whole, but once it shatters, it can't be repaired to its original strength. But even as she spoke, Alan could see something in her eyes that suggested the possibility of forgiveness, though perhaps not forgetting. Rosa had learned to expect disappointment from people whose wealth made them suspicious of everyone's motives, but she had also seen evidence that hearts could change when given proper reason and opportunity. "I know I don't deserve another chance," Alan said, "but I'm asking for one anyway. Not just as an employer, but as someone who learned what friendship meant by losing it. You were right about wealth and richness. I was rich in money, but poor in everything that mattered. You showed me the difference, and I threw it away because I was afraid of being fooled. But the real fool was the man who had something genuine and couldn't recognize its value." They talked for a long time, standing beside Rosa's tamale cart while her neighborhood flowed around them like a river, carrying life in all its complex beauty. Other vendors called greetings to Rosa. Children bought snacks with coins carefully saved. Elderly customers lingered to share news and gossip in the mixture of Spanish and English that made this community feel like an extended family. Alan observed this world with new appreciation, understanding that Rosa's humility and grace came from belonging to something larger than individual success or failure. Eventually, Rosa agreed to return, but with conditions that acknowledged how their relationship had changed. She would work for him again, but as an equal partner in maintaining his home rather than simply an employee who followed orders. Their friendship, if it was to be rebuilt, would be constructed on stronger foundations that could withstand the pressures that had destroyed its earlier incarnation. The penthouse welcomed Rosa's return like a garden greeting spring rain. Windows opened, plants revived, and music resumed flowing through rooms that had been holding their breath during her absence. But the atmosphere was different now. More mature, less innocent, tempered by experience that had taught both Rosa and Alan that trust was precious, precisely because it was fragile. That friendship between people from different worlds required constant attention and protection from outside forces that would destroy it without malice, but with the casual indifference of systems that preferred maintaining distance between classes. Alan's business practices continued evolving, influenced by Rosa's example of finding richness in simple things and meaning in service to others. His philanthropic activities expanded beyond tax-advantaged donations to include personal involvement in community organizations that Rosa introduced him to, literacy programs for immigrant adults, job training initiatives that helped domestic workers develop additional skills, scholarship funds that supported young people from working-class families who dreamed of education but lacked resources to pursue it. Rosa, meanwhile, grew more confident in expressing her opinions and sharing her wisdom, understanding that Alan valued her insights about human nature and community responsibility. She helped him navigate relationships with his children, who gradually began calling home more frequently as their father's emotional availability increased. Her presence in the penthouse didn't make it feel like a different place. It helped it become the home it had always possessed the potential to be. Months passed, seasons changed, and Chicago's rhythms continued carrying both Rosa and Alan through experiences that deepened their friendship while respecting the boundaries that different backgrounds inevitably created. They shared meals more frequently, conversations that ranged from practical household matters to philosophical discussions about purpose and meaning. Rosa taught Alan recipes that required patience rather than expensive ingredients, while he shared books and music that expanded her world in ways that money couldn't measure. Their relationship became a bridge between worlds that rarely connected meaningfully, not erasing the differences between wealth and working-class life, but creating space where mutual respect and genuine affection could flourish despite those differences. Visitors to the penthouse often commented on the atmosphere of warmth and authenticity that distinguished it from other wealthy homes they had experienced, though they rarely understood that the difference came from Rosa's presence and Alan's growing wisdom about what made spaces feel truly alive. One evening in late spring, as Chicago's skyline gleamed with sunset light that transformed steel and glass into gold and amber, Rosa and Alan sat on his terrace overlooking Lake Michigan, The water stretched toward horizons that promised nothing but held infinite possibility, its surface calm enough to reflect the sky's changing moods. They watched in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that friendship could survive betrayal if both parties were willing to do the work of rebuilding it with stronger materials. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't asked about the wasted food?" Rosa asked, her voice soft enough to blend with the evening breeze. Alan considered the question seriously, recognizing it as more than casual curiosity. "I think I would have continued living without really being alive," he said, "accumulating wealth while losing everything that made it worthwhile." "You asked a simple question that changed my entire understanding of abundance and scarcity, having and being. And I learned that sometimes the people we serve need healing as much as the people who serve them," Rosa replied. "Wealth can be a prison as confining as poverty, just with more comfortable bars." She paused, watching sailboats navigate the lake's gentle currents like prayers seeking answers. We were both wounded in different ways, and somehow helping each other heal became possible. As darkness settled over Chicago, lights began appearing in windows throughout the city. Families gathering for dinner, students reading by lamplight, night shift workers beginning their day while others ended theirs. The view from Alan's penthouse encompassed all these lives, each one important, each one carrying hopes and dreams and struggles that wealth could ease but not eliminate entirely. Rosa and Alan continued sitting together, two people who had discovered that healing was possible across any divide, economic, cultural, emotional, when approached with genuine desire to understand rather than judgment. Their friendship had become proof that bridges could be built between any two worlds if both sides were willing to meet in the middle, carrying respect and recognition of shared humanity despite different circumstances. "I have something for you," Alan said eventually, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw an envelope. "Not a bonus or a gift, but something I should have given you long ago." Inside was a letter of recommendation so glowing it could have opened doors Rosa had never imagined walking through. But more importantly, it was formal acknowledgement of her worth from someone whose opinion carried weight in worlds where such recognition could transform lives. Rosa read the letter carefully, understanding its significance not just as a professional document, but as evidence that her dignity and competence had been truly seen and valued. "Thank you," she said simply, though the words carried depths of gratitude for recognition that went far beyond employment references. They remained on the terrace until late, their conversation meandering through topics that friends discuss when time feels abundant and connection feels precious. The city below them continued its nightly rhythms, traffic thinning to essential travelers, late restaurants serving final customers, security guards beginning rounds that would protect sleeping citizens until dawn, brought new possibilities. Eventually, Rosa prepared to leave for her journey home, the same commute she had made hundreds of times, but now traveled with different understanding of her own value and the impact that quiet service could have on hearts that seemed impenetrable, but were actually hungry for genuine human connection. Alan walked her to the service elevator, a gesture that acknowledged their relationship had transcended simple employer-employee boundaries to become something rarer and more valuable. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, though both understood that their future was secure in ways that went beyond employment contracts. "Same time tomorrow," Rosa confirmed, stepping into the elevator that would carry her back to her own world, her own neighborhood, her own life that was rich in ways that money couldn't measure but could appreciate. As the elevator doors closed, Alan returned to his penthouse that no longer felt like a beautiful prison, but like a home where authentic life happened daily. Rosa's presence had taught him that wealth was a responsibility that came with opportunities to create beauty, foster growth, and build bridges across the chasms that society constructed between people whose circumstances differed, but whose essential humanity remained constant. The plants Rosa had introduced continued thriving, their growth visible proof that even the most unlikely environments could nurture life when someone cared enough to provide proper attention. Music played softly throughout the rooms, melodies that Rosa hummed while working, classical pieces that Alan had rediscovered, jazz that bridged cultures and generations with universal languages of rhythm and soul. In her small apartment in Pilsen, Rosa prepared for another day, her movements carrying the dignity of someone whose worth had been recognized and affirmed. She had learned that service was not diminishment, but potential pathway to profound impact on human hearts that needed healing. Her work the next day would be the same tasks she had performed for months, but they would be carried out with knowledge that simple acts of care could transform lives in ways that seemed magical, but were actually evidence of love's practical power to heal wounds that money couldn't touch. And you? Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs hope today. For more heartfelt stories, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional road with us. See you in the next story. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Rosa and Alan's story. A reminder that dignity knows no economic boundaries, that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources, and that healing happens when hearts remain open to recognizing the humanity that connects us all, regardless of the circumstances that seem to separate us. Their friendship became proof that bridges can be built between any two worlds when both sides approach each other with respect, recognition, and the courage to see beyond surface differences to the shared experiences of loss, hope, and the universal need for connection that makes us all wealthy in the ways that matter most.